Hey guys, I've debated sharing this for over a year now. I used to be an avid urban explorer. You know the type, sneaking into abandoned asylums, documenting forgotten history, chasing that eerie thrill of walking where people haven't stepped in decades. I always thought the worst thing I'd ever encounter was black mold, a collapsing floorboard, or maybe a grumpy squatter. I was dead wrong. What happened to me in the Appalachian backcountry completely broke my mind. I don't go into the woods anymore. Hell, I don't even like sitting in a dark room. It was late October. The air was biting, carrying that distinct, sharp smell of decaying leaves, wet pine, and cold earth. My target was a place called Oak Haven, a forgotten 1920s logging town nestled in a valley so deep and narrow it barely got 4 hours of direct sunlight a day. It had been completely abandoned after a catastrophic mudslide wiped out the only access road and half the settlement. To get there, I had to hike 8 miles off-trail, navigating purely by GPS coordinates and a laminated topographic map. The deeper I went into the woods, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The canopy above grew so thick that the afternoon sun was choked out, casting the forest floor in a perpetual, sickly twilight. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels darting up the bark, no wind rustling the branches. Just the steady, rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of my hiking boots on dead foliage, and the labored sound of my own breathing. I remember stopping a few times to drink water, and every time I stopped moving, I had the distinct skin-crawling sensation of eyes boring into the back of my neck. I just chalked it up to paranoia and the sheer isolation. I finally breached the tree line just as the sun was starting to dip behind the jagged peaks, stretching long, distorted shadows across the valley floor. And there it was, Oak Haven. It looked like the rotting corpse of a town. Skeletal wooden frames of houses jutted out of the overgrown briar patches like broken ribs. Rusted logging machinery lay half buried in the mud, choked by thick, thorny vines. The atmosphere was incredibly oppressive. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt like you were interrupting a conversation? That's what the entire valley felt like. A heavy, stagnant dread settled in the pit of my stomach. But I pushed the fear down. I'd hiked 8 hours for these photos, and I wasn't turning back now. I decided to set up my base camp in what used to be the town's small church. It sat on a slight hill and was the only structure that still had a mostly intact roof. I pushed open the heavy oak doors. They shrieked in protest, kicking up a thick cloud of dust that danced in the pale shafts of light filtering through the cracked, dirt-caked windows. The inside smelled profoundly of mildew, animal droppings, and ancient earth. I dropped my heavy 50-pound pack to the floor with a loud thud and pulled out my tactical flashlight to inspect the space. I swept the harsh white beam across the rotting, overturned pews, over the collapsed wooden altar, and then the beam stopped. In the far corner of the room, right behind where the pulpit used to be, was a sleeping bag. But it wasn't old or rotting. It was a modern, insulated mummy bag. Surrounding it was a scattering of freshly emptied bean cans, several plastic water bottles, and a large serrated hunting knife driven deep into the floorboards. But that wasn't the worst part. Nailed to the wall directly above the sleeping bag were dozens of Polaroid photographs. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest, and shined my light on them. Every single photo was of me. Pictures of me hiking. Pictures of me drinking water, pictures taken from the brush just minutes ago. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't alone out here. And then, from the thick brush just outside the shattered window directly behind me, I heard a sharp, deliberate whistle. That whistle. I still hear it in my nightmares. It wasn't the sound of an animal, and it wasn't the wind whistling through the rotted wood. It was a sharp, deliberate, two-note melody. It was almost playful. I completely froze. My brain short-circuited as a primal, instinctual panic flooded my veins. My hands shook so violently that the beam of my tactical flashlight danced wildly across the wall, illuminating those Polaroids in jagged flashes. The picture in the center was of me wiping sweat off my forehead with my bandana. a picture taken maybe 3 miles back near a creek. Whoever took these had been tracking me all day, stepping where I stepped completely undetected, and now they were standing right outside that shattered window. I didn't turn around. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to look, to see what kind of face belonged to that whistle. But I knew if I met its eyes, I would lose whatever shred of composure I had left. Instead, I lunged for my gear. I didn't even try to grab my heavy 50-pound pack. It would only slow me down. I snatched my smaller camera bag, which held my headlamp, spare batteries, a first aid kit, and a small folding utility knife, and bolted for the heavy oak doors of the church. As I threw my weight against the doors to push them open, another sound cut through the suffocating silence. A low, guttural chuckle. It sounded wet and raspy, like a dry cough dragging through a throat full of gravel. I burst out into the freezing evening air, practically tearing the doors off their rusted hinges. The sun had fully dipped behind the mountains now. The valley was plunging into a deep, bruised purple twilight that made the skeletal frames of the rotting houses blur and stretch into monstrous shapes. Running back into the forest was suicide. 8 miles of dense, off-trail Appalachian wilderness in the pitch black, with someone who clearly knew these woods intimately hunting me? I wouldn't make it a mile. I needed to find a defensible position, a place I could barricade myself inside until the sun came up. I sprinted down the overgrown main street, my boots slipping on wet, mossy rocks and decaying timber. I ducked behind the rusted husk of an old logging truck, gasping for air, pressing my hands against my mouth to muffle my ragged breathing. I scanned the decaying remnants of Oak Haven. About 50 yards away, standing slightly apart from the collapsing wooden cabins, was a 2-story structure made of thick, mortar-bound stone. It looked like an old bank or a company vault. More importantly, it had a heavy, solid iron door that sat slightly ajar. I broke cover and scrambled toward it, tearing my forearms and tearing my jacket on the thick, thorny briar bushes that choked the pathway. I slipped through the narrow gap into the stone building and put my back against the iron door, shoving it shut. It scraped agonizingly against the concrete floor, echoing loudly, but it closed with a heavy thud. I found a rusted length of iron piping resting against a nearby wall and wedged it under the door handle, creating a makeshift barricade. I collapsed against the freezing stone wall, my chest heaving, straining my ears to listen to the outside. Nothing. Just that oppressive, ringing silence returning to the valley. I pulled out my headlamp and clicked it under the lowest red light setting so the glow wouldn't bleed through any cracks in the stone. The interior was a cavernous, empty room stripped bare decades ago. But as my eyes adjusted to the crimson hue, I noticed something completely unnatural about the floor. The thick, century-old layer of gray dust had been disturbed. There were wide, continuous drag marks sweeping across the room, leading directly towards a heavy wooden trap door set into the floorboards in the far corner. I crept over to it, my utility knife gripped so tightly in my hand that my knuckles ached. As I got closer, the distinct metallic smell of old pennies hit the back of my throat. Blood. I knelt down, hooked my fingers through the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor, and pulled. As it creaked open, I shined my red light into the space below, and a scream hitched in my throat.
The beam of my red headlamp cut through the darkness beneath the trapdoor, illuminating a set of steep, rotting wooden stairs that descended into a sprawling root cellar. The metallic stench of old blood was overpowering down here, mixed with the choking odor of damp earth and ammonia. My stomach heaved, but the sheer adrenaline coursing through my system kept me from vomiting. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to slam the heavy wooden hatch shut and pile debris on top of it. But I had to know what I was dealing with. I had to know if there was another way out. I gripped my small utility knife so tight my palm cramped, and I slowly descended the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, sounding like a gunshot in the suffocating silence of the stone building above. The cellar was surprisingly massive, supported by thick timber pillars. As I swept my crimson light across the packed dirt floor, the horrifying reality of my situation finally crystallized. This wasn't a squatter's den. It was a slaughterhouse. In the center of the room sat a massive scarred wooden table. It was stained a deep mottled black. Lined up with obsessive, sickening neatness along the edge of the table were various tools, a rusted handsaw, several hunting knives of varying lengths, heavy-duty zip ties, and a pair of bolt cutters. But it was the far corner of the cellar that made my knees completely give out. Piled haphazardly against the damp stone wall was a mountain of camping gear. Brightly colored Osprey and North Face backpacks, muddied hiking boots, deflated sleeping pads, and a terrifying amount of torn clothing. I stumbled over to the pile, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I used my boot to nudge a blue synthetic jacket, and a small, rectangular piece of plastic clattered onto the dirt. I picked it up with a trembling, gloved hand. It was a driver's license, belonging to a 22-year-old girl from Pennsylvania. I recognized her face immediately. I had seen her picture on a missing persons flyer pinned to the trailhead bulletin board 8 miles away. My mind raced, connecting the terrifying dots. The Polaroids in the church, the deliberate, mocking whistle, the wide drag marks on the floor above. This person didn't just live in the ruins of Oakhaven. They used the town as a spider web. They waited for urban explorers, hikers, thrill seekers, people like me who ventured too far off the grid, and they hunted them. And I had just locked myself inside their workshop. I scrambled backward, away from the pile of dead hikers' belongings, desperate to get back up the stairs. The iron door on the main floor was heavy, but if this guy had dragged bodies in here, he knew exactly how to get inside. Suddenly, the entire cellar shuddered. A massive, deafening bang echoed from the floorboards directly above my head. Dust and loose dirt rained down on me in the red glow of my headlamp. Someone had just slammed their entire body weight against the heavy iron door of the stone building. I froze at the bottom of the cellar stairs, holding my breath. 10 seconds passed in agonizing silence. Then, a horrific sound echoed down into the cellar. The screeching, metallic scrape of the iron pipe I had wedged under the door handle being slowly, forcefully pushed across the concrete floor. The barricade was failing.
The scraping of the iron pipe sounded like a dying animal screaming against the concrete. Screech! A pause, then another violent, bone-rattling bang against the heavy iron door above. A shower of century-old dust and dry mortar rained down through the floorboards, coating my sweaty neck in grit. My mind fractured into a dozen different panicked thoughts. I was trapped in a kill room. There was only one staircase up, and the monster who owned this slaughterhouse was currently forcing his way inside. Screech! The pipe gave way completely with a final echoing clatter. The heavy iron door groaned open, its rusted hinges protesting loudly, followed by the heavy, deliberate thud of work boots stepping onto the concrete floor. I killed my red headlamp instantly. Absolute, suffocating darkness swallowed me whole. I pressed my back against the cold, damp stone wall of the cellar, clutching my pathetic little utility knife. Above me, the floorboards creaked under immense weight. The footsteps were slow, methodical. He wasn't rushing. He knew I was down here, and he knew there was nowhere for me to go. Thud, thud, thud. He was pacing the room above, his boots dragging slightly with each step. Then that sound returned, that low, wet, gravelly chuckle. It vibrated through the wood directly over my head. He was toying with me. I had to move. I dropped to my hands and knees, ignoring the overwhelming stench of copper and ammonia, and began blindly feeling along the cellar walls. My hands scraped against rough-hewn stone and slimy patches of mold. I was desperate for anything. A collapsed wall, a ventilation shaft, a drainage pipe. The air down here had to be circulating somehow. It was stale, but I wasn't suffocating. Above me, the heavy scraping of a boot paused right over the trapdoor. My heart hammered so violently against my ribs I thought it might crack them. I crawled faster, my fingers tearing on jagged rocks. I hit the back corner of the cellar, right behind the mountain of stolen camping gear. My hands frantically patted the wall, and suddenly, my fingers slipped into a gap, an opening.
I felt around the edges. It was an old coal chute or a drainage tunnel, maybe 2 feet wide, lined with crumbling brick. It was barely big enough for a person, but it was my only chance. Above, the iron ring of the trapdoor clanked loudly. I shoved my camera bag into the hole and squeezed my head and shoulders in after it. The tunnel was agonizingly tight, smelling strongly of wet clay and decaying roots. I had to exhale completely just to wedge my chest through the opening, wriggling like a worm into the pitch-black earth. Just as my boots cleared the cellar floor, the heavy wooden trapdoor above slammed open. A blinding, high-lumen beam of white light sliced down the wooden staircase, illuminating the horrific, blood-stained table and the pile of stolen gear. I froze in the tight tunnel, barely 5 feet away, pressing my face into the cold mud to hide any reflection from my eyes. Heavy boots descended the wooden stairs. Creak, creak, creak. I couldn't see his face, only his lower half from my vantage point in the tunnel. He was wearing heavy, mud-caked logger boots and filthy canvas pants stained dark with old blood. In one hand, swinging casually by his side, was a massive, rusted woodman's axe. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight sweeping the room. Then he stopped. He leaned down, picking up something from the dirt. It was the Pennsylvania girl's ID, the one I had dropped in my panic. The beam of his flashlight snapped directly toward the corner where I was hiding. The blinding white light flooded the entrance of the coal chute, illuminating the tips of my boots. "Found you," a raspy voice whispered.
The moment those words left his mouth, a hand the size of a catcher's mitt shot into the narrow tunnel. Fingers thick as sausages, reeking of raw meat and damp earth, clamped around my left ankle with bone-crushing force. I screamed. It wasn't a yell or a shout, it was a pathetic, high-pitched wail of pure, unadulterated terror. I kicked out violently with my right leg, my heel connecting with something solid, a wrist or an arm, but his grip didn't even loosen. He began to pull. The rough brick of the chute tore through my jacket and shredded the skin on my shoulders as I was dragged backward toward the cellar, toward the blood-stained table. Panic took over completely. I contorted my body in the agonizingly tight space, using my free foot to push against the crumbling wall of the tunnel, fighting him with everything I had. I twisted my trapped leg as hard as I could, feeling my ankle pop. My hiking boot snagged on a jagged piece of mortar. With one final desperate thrash, my foot slipped out of the boot entirely. I didn't wait a single second. I scrambled forward on my belly, propelling myself deeper into the suffocating darkness of the pipe with only one shoe on. Behind me, I heard a grunt of frustration, followed by the dull thud of my heavy hiking boot being tossed onto the dirt floor. "Little rabbit," the gravelly voice echoed up the pipe, distorted and amplified by the confined space. It was followed by that wet, rattling chuckle. Then, the blinding beam of the flashlight clicked off. I froze in the pitch black, my chest heaving against the cold, slimy mud of the tunnel floor, trying to muffle my ragged breaths. I waited for him to start hacking at the brick with his axe, or for him to try and wedge himself into the hole, but he didn't. Instead, I heard the heavy, methodical creak, creak, creak of his boots walking away from the chute and back up the wooden cellar stairs. A new kind of dread washed over me, colder than the mud soaking through my clothes. He wasn't giving up. He knew exactly where this drainage pipe led. He was going back outside to wait for me at the other end. It was a race. I began to crawl like a madman. The tunnel was barely 2 feet in diameter, a claustrophobic nightmare of slick clay, rotted leaves, and rusted iron. The smell was horrendous, a mix of stagnant water and decaying rodents. Every time I exhaled, my ribs scraped against the top of the pipe. Spiders and centipedes rained down on my neck and face as I disturbed the century-old webs webbing the ceiling, but I couldn't stop to brush them off. I had to keep moving. The icy slush at the bottom of the chute soaked my socked foot, sending needles of pain up my leg, but the adrenaline masked the worst of it. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but darkness, the scraping of my own body, and the terrifying echo of my heartbeat in my ears. The air was getting thinner, tasting stale and metallic. I was starting to hyperventilate, the sheer crushing weight of the earth above me triggering a massive panic attack. Then I saw it. About 20 yards ahead, a faint, silvery glow. Moonlight. The pipe was sloping slightly upward. I pushed myself faster, tearing my fingernails on the rough brick, dragging my camera bag behind me by the strap. As I got closer, the glow resolved into the shape of a heavy iron drainage grate, partially blocked by dead branches and wet foliage. The cold night air drifted through the bars, hitting my sweat-drenched face. I had made it. I reached the end of the tunnel. I shoved my hands through the thick layer of wet leaves, wrapping my bleeding fingers around the freezing, rusted iron bars of the grate. I pushed upward with all the strength I had left. It shifted with a loud, metallic scrape, lifting a few inches. I took a deep breath, preparing to heave it completely open and make a run for the tree line. But before I could push again, a massive, mud-caked logger boot stepped out of the darkness and slammed directly onto the center of the grate, violently pinning my fingers between the heavy iron bars.
The pain was instantaneous and blinding. The immense weight of the steel-toed logger boot pressed the freezing, rusted iron bars directly into my knuckles, crushing my fingers against the brick rim of the chute. I bit down on my own lips so hard that my mouth flooded with the hot, metallic taste of my own blood. I refused to scream again. I refused to give him that satisfaction. The heavy boot didn't move. Instead, the man slowly crouched down, his massive frame eclipsing the pale moonlight that had been my beacon of hope. For the first time, I saw him. He looked like he had been born from the rot of the woods itself. His hair and beard were a tangled, matted bird's nest of grease and dried mud. His skin was unnaturally pale, smeared with soot and dark, rusted stains that I knew were blood. But it was his eyes that truly paralyzed me. They weren't the manic, wild eyes of a rabid animal. They were completely flat, dead, and black, lacking even a microscopic shred of human empathy. He looked at me the way a butcher looks at a slab of meat on a cutting board. "Squirming makes the meat tough," he whispered. His breath drifted down through the iron grate, washing over my face. It smelled unimaginably foul, a nauseating mixture of rotting meat, chewing tobacco, and severe tooth decay. He stood back up in a smooth, fluid motion, his boots still pinning my left hand. He raised the massive, rusted woodman's axe high above his head, the heavy iron head silhouetted against the night sky. He was going to bring it straight down through the grate and cleave my skull in two. Adrenaline completely overrode my sense of self-preservation. Just as his shoulder muscles tensed to swing, I violently yanked my hands backward down the pipe. The iron bars shredded the skin off the backs of my fingers, and I felt two of my fingernails violently tear away. A split second later, the axe came down with the force of a freight train. Crash! Sparks showered my face as the heavy iron blade obliterated the century-old grate. Rusted metal shrapnel and shattered brick exploded into the pipe, peppering my face and shoulders. But the sheer force of his swing was his undoing. The thick wedge of the axe blade bit incredibly deep into the reinforced brick and mortar of the drainage collar, getting stuck fast. The man let out a wet, furious grunt, violently jerking the wooden handle back and forth to free his weapon. It was the only window I was ever going to get. Ignoring the agonizing throbbing in my mangled hands, I lunged forward. I shoved the shattered, mangled remnants of the iron grate aside and clawed my way out of the earth. The freezing Appalachian night air hit my soaking wet clothes like a physical blow, instantly chilling me to the bone. I didn't bother standing up completely. I scrambled on all fours like a panicked animal, pushing off the frozen ground and bolting blindly into the pitch-black tree line of the surrounding forest. I had no headlamp. I had no supplies. I had one heavy hiking boot on my right foot, while my left foot was clad only in a soaked, mud-caked wool sock. With every step, jagged rocks, frozen pine cones, and thorny briars tore into my unprotected heel, sending hot streaks of agony up my fractured ankle. I didn't care. I just ran. I ran until my lungs burned with the cold and my vision blurred with tears of pain. Behind me, echoing through the decaying ruins of Oakhaven, I heard the sickening sound of the axe finally ripping free from the brickwork. It was followed by a roar of pure, unadulterated rage that didn't sound entirely human. The heavy, crashing sounds of his boots tearing through the underbrush began, and they were moving incredibly fast. I dove blindly into a dense thicket of mountain laurel, pressing my back against a massive oak tree, praying the oppressive darkness would hide me. My chest heaved violently as I clamped my bleeding, mangled hands over my mouth to silence my own breathing. I listened to his heavy footsteps crushing the dead leaves, drawing closer and closer. But as I sat there shivering in the dirt, a warm, wet sensation seeped through my ruined sock. I looked down in the faint moonlight. I had dragged my bare foot across broken glass or sharp shale during my sprint. I wasn't just leaving a scent. I was leaving a highly visible, unbroken trail of fresh blood painted across the dead leaves, leading directly to my hiding spot.
The realization that I was bleeding out a perfect map to my location hit me like a physical blow. The metallic tang of blood was sharp in the freezing air, and I knew with absolute certainty that the man with the dead eyes could smell it just as easily as I could. The heavy, rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of his boots was no longer frantic. It was methodical. He wasn't running anymore. He was tracking. I had to move. If I stayed huddled under that oak tree, he would find me in minutes. I pushed myself up, biting down so hard on my torn lip that fresh blood welled in my mouth. My left foot, the one missing the boot, was completely numb from the cold, but every time I put weight on it, a white-hot spike of agony shot up my calf. I couldn't run, not truly. I had to limp, dragging my mangled foot through the underbrush as quietly as I could. I forced myself deeper into the pitch-black Appalachian wilderness, moving completely blind. The canopy above was so thick that the moonlight barely penetrated, leaving the forest floor an inky, confusing mess of shadows and sharp edges. I tripped over exposed roots, tearing my hands on thorny briars as I blindly broke my falls. I was operating purely on primal terror. Behind me, the woods were utterly silent, except for the terrifying sound of his pursuit. He didn't use a flashlight. He didn't need one. He moved through the dense forest with an eerie, impossible grace for a man his size, occasionally pausing, likely checking the ground for the dark, wet smears I was leaving behind. Then the whistling started again. It was that same sharp, deliberate two-note melody. It echoed through the trees, impossible to pinpoint. Was it coming from my left, my right, directly behind me? It was a psychological weapon designed to keep me panicked, to keep me making mistakes. The sound crawled under my skin, vibrating in my teeth. It was the sound of a predator playing with its food. I scrambled up a steep, muddy embankment, my fingers digging into the freezing earth for purchase. As I crested the top, my right foot, the one still wearing the heavy hiking boots, slipped on a patch of wet shale. I pitched forward, tumbling head over heels down the other side of the ridge. I crashed through a thicket of dry brush, my camera bag violently smacking against my ribs. I landed hard on my back in a shallow, stagnant creek bed, the icy water instantly soaking through my jacket and chilling me to the bone. I lay there for a second, the wind completely knocked out of me, staring up at the slivers of night sky visible through the skeletal branches. My lungs burned, and the pain in my crushed fingers and torn foot was agonizing. I was exhausted. A dark, seductive thought crept into my mind. Just stay here. It will be over soon. But the splash of water brought me back. I was lying in a creek. Water washes away blood. Water hides scents. It was the oldest trick in the book, but it was the only trick I had left. I forced myself onto my hands and knees, ignoring the agonizing protests of my body, and began to crawl upstream through the freezing, ankle-deep water. The creek was narrow and choked with deadwood, winding its way through a dense grove of towering hemlocks. The sound of the running water covered the noise of my splashing, but the cold was paralyzing. My teeth chattered violently, and I could feel my core temperature plummeting.
If the maniac didn't kill me, hypothermia certainly would. I waited for maybe 20 minutes, my movements sluggish and uncoordinated. I needed shelter. I needed to get out of the wind and hide until the sun came up, though I had no idea how many hours away that was. As the creek bent sharply around a massive boulder, the faint moonlight illuminated a dark opening at the base of the rock face. It was a small natural cave or a deep overhang, partially obscured by heavy ferns. I dragged myself out of the freezing water, my muscles locking up, and crawled into the cramped, dry space. It was small, barely big enough for me to curl into a fetal position, but it smelled of dry earth and old leaves, not rot. I pulled my knees to my chest, burying my face in my freezing, muddy hands, praying the creek had broken my trail. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the water and my own ragged breathing. I started to drift into a dangerous hypothermic haze. And then I heard it, not the whistle. A sharp, distinct snap of a heavy branch breaking under a boot less than 20 feet away from the cave entrance.
The snap of the branch echoed like a gunshot in the cramped, freezing darkness of the cave. I instantly stopped breathing, clamping my mangled, bloody hands tightly over my mouth and nose. My heart hammered so violently against my ribs that I was terrified he could hear it over the babble of the creek. Crunch. Splash. He had stepped into the water. The heavy, deliberate sloshing of his logger boots moved slowly upstream. He hadn't lost my trail at all. Or maybe he just knew these woods so intimately that he anticipated my exact survival strategy. The overwhelming stench of him arrived before he did. The freezing air rushing into the cave suddenly soured, carrying that same nauseating cocktail of chewing tobacco, rotting meat, and stale sweat I had smelled in the drainage pipe. It was so thick it made my eyes water. Splash, splash. He stopped. He was standing directly outside the fern-covered entrance to my little overhang. I was curled into a tight, shivering ball, pressing myself so hard into the jagged rock wall at the back of the cave that it cut through my soaked jacket. For an agonizing minute, there was nothing but the sound of the freezing water rushing around his boots. Then that gravelly, wet voice cut through the dark. "Water's cold, Rabbit," he whispered. It wasn't a shout. He was speaking conversationally, like we were sharing a campfire. "Mighty cold for a boy with one shoe. Hypothermia sets in quick. Your blood gets thick like syrup. Your brain gets fuzzy. You just want to lay down and sleep." A beam of harsh white light suddenly slashed through the ferns, painting the opposite wall of the creek bank. He was sweeping his flashlight, looking for where I got out. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying the dense shadows of the cave would swallow me. "You're shivering," the voice purred. "I can hear your teeth clicking from out here. Sounds like a rattlesnake." My blood ran completely cold. I clamped my jaw shut so hard my gums ached, but the violent, uncontrollable tremors racking my hypothermic body were making my wet clothes rustle against the dry leaves beneath me. He had incredible hearing. He wasn't just a brute, he was an apex predator perfectly adapted to this environment. The white beam of the flashlight abruptly snapped off. Complete, suffocating darkness returned to the creek. "I'm gonna find you," he stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "And when I do, I'm gonna take my time. I'm gonna start with your good foot." I heard the heavy slosh of his boots moving again, but he didn't walk past the cave. He took a step closer to the bank. The ferns rustled violently as something massive brushed against them. My hand blindly patted the ground in the pitch black, searching for anything, a heavy rock, a sharp piece of shale to use as a weapon. My fingers brushed against the wet nylon strap of my camera bag. In my blind panic, I had dragged it all the way here. As my hand slid over the fabric, my stomach completely dropped. The bag had a small, hard plastic safety whistle attached to the chest strap. It was a cheap survival feature, designed with a photoluminescent coating to glow in the dark. I had completely forgotten about it. I opened my eyes and looked down at my lap.
In the absolute pitch-black darkness of the cave, the tiny plastic whistle was emitting a faint, unmistakable neon green glow. It was practically a beacon. A massive, filthy hand suddenly thrust through the ferns, violently ripping them away from the cave entrance. The pale moonlight immediately spilled in, illuminating the cramped space. And standing there, entirely blocking my only exit, was the massive silhouette of the killer. His flat, dead eyes locked under the glowing green whistle resting on my lap, and then slowly drifted up to meet my terrified gaze. A sickening, jagged smile split his beard. He raised the rusted woodman's axe. Gotcha.
The rusted iron blade of the axe came down with terrifying speed. I didn't have time to think, only react. I violently threw my hands up, shoving my heavy canvas camera bag directly into the path of the swing. The heavy blade cleaved straight through the thick fabric and smashed into my DSLR camera with a sickening crunch. A spray of shattered plastic and glass exploded into my face, cutting my cheek. The sheer kinetic force of the blow violently wrenched the bag from my freezing hands and deflected the axe just inches past my right shoulder. The blade buried itself inches deep into the dirt and shale floor of the cave. The man let out a wet grunt of surprise, his massive shoulders rolling as he instantly tried to jerk the weapon free. I didn't hesitate. I didn't try to scramble backward deeper into the overhang. I lunged forward, throwing my entire body weight directly at his legs. It was a purely animalistic reflex. My shoulder ramped squarely into his kneecap. Striking him felt like hitting a concrete piling, but the slippery, moss-covered rocks of the creek bed betrayed him. He staggered backward with a furious roar, his hand slipping off the axe handle, and crashed heavily into the freezing, knee-deep water. I scrambled right over him, thrashing wildly through the churning creek. Every single step on my bare, lacerated foot sent an agonizing shockwave up my spine, but the adrenaline completely masked the worst of it. "You little rat!" he bellowed from the water behind me, the sound of his massive frame splashing violently as he fought to recover his footing. I didn't look back. I clawed my way up the steep, muddy embankment on the opposite side of the creek, my ruined fingers digging desperately into exposed roots and frozen earth. I burst through a thicket of dead mountain laurel at the top of the ridge and just kept running, dragging my bleeding foot behind me. The terrain was rapidly changing. The dense, claustrophobic pines were thinning out, replaced by jagged boulders and shattered, splintered tree trunks lying on their sides. The freezing wind whipped across my face, biting into my soaked clothes. I looked up through the canopy. The sky was no longer an impenetrable pitch black. A very faint, bruised gray was bleeding into the eastern horizon. Dawn. It was still at least an hour away, but the mere suggestion of light gave me a desperate, hysterical surge of energy. I stumbled out of the tree line and collapsed onto a flat, incredibly hard surface. I pressed my bleeding, trembling palms against it. It wasn't natural stone. It was asphalt. It was cracked, choked with frozen weeds, and buried under decades of dirt, but it was unmistakably the old, destroyed logging road that led out of the valley. A pathetic, bubbling laugh tore through my bleeding lips. A road meant a way out. I just had to follow it. I pushed myself up, limping as fast as my shattered body would allow down the center of the forgotten highway. But as I rounded a sharp bend, my heart plummeted completely into my stomach. The road didn't continue. Less than 50 yards ahead, asphalt violently buckled and abruptly vanished into a massive sheer drop-off. This was the site of the catastrophic mudslide I had read about, the disaster that had cut Oak Haven off from the world nearly a century ago. A massive chunk of the mountain had simply fallen away, leaving a jagged, unstable cliff that dropped hundreds of feet into a canopy of dark pines below. I stumbled to the very edge of the abyss, kicking a loose chunk of asphalt over the side. I never heard it hit the bottom. There was no way down. The road was a literal dead end. And then, from the dark tree line I had just emerged from, came the heavy, deliberate crunch of a logger boot stepping onto the old asphalt. I slowly turned around,
the freezing wind threatening to push me over the edge. The massive silhouette stepped out of the shadows, his chest heaving, the rusted axe dripping with muddy creek water in his right hand. He tilted his head, flashing that sickening, jagged smile in the pale pre-dawn light. He raised his free hand, extending a thick, filthy finger, and pointed it directly at my chest.
There was nowhere left to run. The freezing wind whipped up the face of the sheer drop behind me, howling in my ears and biting into my soaked clothes. I stood at the very edge of the abyss, my ruined left foot throbbing with a sickening, wet heat, while my right heel hung over nothing but hundreds of feet of empty air. The man with the dead eyes didn't rush. He knew exactly where we were. He took his time, his massive logger boots scraping methodically against the cracked asphalt. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The rusted head of the woodman's axe dragged behind him, leaving a jagged white scar down the center of the forgotten highway. "End of the line, rabbit," he rasped, the gravelly voice barely carrying over the wind. He stopped about 10 feet away. In the pale, bruised light of the approaching dawn, he looked even more terrifying, a towering, filthy monument of violence. He raised the massive axe with both hands, his knuckles white with anticipation. I looked down at his feet, and in that split second, a desperate, insane realization hit me. The asphalt beneath him wasn't solid. The catastrophic mudslide that had destroyed this road a century ago hadn't just sheared off the edge, it had completely undermined the foundation. Deep, jagged spiderweb cracks radiated out from the spot where he stood, leading directly to the crumbling lip where I was balanced. The earth beneath us was completely hollow. He let out a guttural, wet roar and charged. He didn't swing gracefully. He threw his entire massive body weight forward into a devastating downward cleave, meant to split my skull in half. I didn't try to block it. I didn't try to back up. In the exact fraction of a second that the axe reached the apex of its arc, I threw my entire body violently to the right, diving completely parallel to the cliff edge. The heavy iron blade missed my shoulder by millimeters, slicing through the freezing air with a vicious whoosh. The sheer, unstoppable momentum of his swing carried him forward. His heavy boots slammed down directly onto the very edge of the unstable asphalt where I had just been standing. Crack! It sounded like a gunshot. The brittle, century-old asphalt violently buckled under his immense weight. A massive chunk of the roadbed, roughly the size of a small car, simply detached from the mountain. For a single frozen second, his flat, dead eyes met mine as I lay gasping on the solid pavement. There was no fear in them, just a flash of cold, calculating realization. And then gravity took him. He didn't scream, he didn't flail. He simply vanished into the abyss, taking the rusted axe and tons of earth down with him into the dark pines below. I didn't hear a crash. The roaring wind simply swallowed him whole. I lay on the freezing asphalt for a long time, staring at the jagged, fresh scar in the earth, my body racked with violent, uncontrollable sobs. I had survived, but the nightmare was far from over. It took me 14 agonizing hours to crawl and limp my way back to a paved state route. A passing trucker found me delirious, severely hypothermic and bleeding out on the shoulder. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, recovering from a shattered ankle, crushed fingers, and severe exposure. I told the state police everything. I drew the maps. I told them about the church, the Polaroids, and the horrific root cellar hidden beneath the stone building. A massive tactical team was dispatched into the Oak Haven Valley. They found the cellar exactly as I described it, complete with the stolen gear and the blood-stained table. They uncovered the remains of 7 different people buried under the floorboards, but they never found him. They searched the base of the cliff for days with cadaver dogs and drones, sifting through the rubble of the collapsed road. They found the rusted head of his woodman's axe, snapped off from its handle, but no body. The police told me the impact likely threw him into the dense river network at the bottom of the gorge, washing him away. But I know better. That kind of evil doesn't just die from a fall, it adapts. I don't go into the woods anymore. I moved to a high-rise apartment in the center of the city, surrounded by concrete, lights, and people. I lock my doors, I double-check my windows, and I never, ever sleep in total darkness. Because every once in a while, when the wind howls just right through the alleyways below my balcony, I swear I can hear it. A sharp, deliberate two-note whistle. Stay out of the deep woods, guys. You have no idea what is waiting for you in the dark.